All right. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Jonathan, for having me and having our students. You already mentioned I was going to introduce my students. I have 13 students here from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and we're touring around the Greater Yellowstone, learning about different issues, and it's been great so far. We're about halfway through, and this is a great event too for them to come and learn about philanthropy, the area a little bit more, and that sort of thing. So, again, thanks for having us. I haven't held a mic like this since I did karaoke. Right. Y'all bust out. My song is Seal, Kissed by a Rose, but maybe later. So, just a quick, again, you sort of stole my thunder here. I was going to tell you a little bit about this book, and as it relates to my next book, too. So I've been doing research in this area my whole academic career. And in this previous book, I looked more at environmental conflict, more generally just using the case of the Greater Yellowstone area to learn a lot about larger issues. So, for example, this one, environmental conflict, what can we learn about that more generally, kind of drawing on this case. And then in my next book, I'm looking more at income and wealth and these issues that our country is facing as a whole, not just here in Teton County. So I really see the GYE as a living laboratory of sorts. And I'm from Wyoming, so I have a personal investment in the area as well. And so it really motivates me in lots of different ways. And hopefully we'll spend my whole career studying Wyoming and the areas around the Greater Yellowstone. And so this means a lot. My research means a lot to me as well. It's not just kind of an academic exercise. So a little bit of background. Jonathan proposed giving a talk here at this conference, largely because of a new book that I've been working on, and this is really the first time, other than some of my students have read most of the manuscript that is completed, but this is the first time I've really presented it publicly, so go easy on me, please. My original goal was, after this Yellowstone book, to write a book focusing not just on environmental conflict and those issues, but on the communities themselves. So basically from Bozeman down to Jackson and some of the towns in between. And as I dug deeper, what really occurred to me over and again was the importance of wealth. And that may not be a new thing for some of us in the room, that Jackson and Teton County, places like Gallatin County, Big Sky, there is a lot of wealth there. But I really wanted to look at the impact of that wealth on the communities themselves. And so it just became more and more central as I started developing this project. And there were other factors too, like growing up, my parents and grandparents would make snarky comments about Jackson, or it's wealthy, as like we don't go over there, the sort of thing like that. And so it was always in my mind. That's more of a negative connotation that, but then also there are significant gaps in academic research and what we know about the super wealthy especially. So those sorts of things are kind of underlying, I would say, motivations, but really prompted the project. And so what I've tried to do is balance kind of focusing on this area in particular and using it as a case study, but also contributing to the larger academic understanding, which should then contribute to the public understanding of wealth. And I'll describe this in a little bit more detail. So the book is called Billionaire Wilderness. It's going to be out next year. I finished the manuscript and we're in the process of editing it, and they've designed the cover and all of these things. It's published by Princeton University Press, which is an academic press, so it's not going to be a New York Times bestseller. It's more focused, again, on scientific analysis, not in such a dry way, but really focused on data and contributing a scholarly understanding of the ultra-wealthy. So a lot of our conceptions about the ultra-wealthy, I think, are captive to simplistic stereotypes, in large part because this group's really difficult to study, at least up close. We can get data, and like the IRS data and these sorts of things, but in terms of like actually spending time doing interviews, which is I'll describe here in a second, this is what was needed essentially. So I set out on a journey to try to move beyond common presumptions that we have, and toward a really a more honest and fact-based account that isn't based on these stereotypes. And I will say though that it's not an effort to coddle or defend ultra wealth at all. I mean, a lot of the issues are somewhat contentious that I deal with in the book, and so my goal really is an honest analysis that has as much depth as I can, and careful reasoning and critique. So the data, what did I actually do? And I'll get to the philanthropy part here, but I want to give you an idea of the whole project itself. So it's based on 5 years of research, and I really took my time with this, and part of it was because it's a difficult topic to study. And so what I did was, the first part of the data were 150 in-depth interviews with folks that last between 1 to 2 hours and involve a slew of questions. Actually, one of my students, Katie here, embarrass you, she helped me set up a lot of the interviews. And so some of my students were part of this process as well. So I've interviewed total about 300 people, but only about 150 are what I would define as either ultra wealthy, it's kind of a nebulous concept, but multi-millionaire, and I lay it out in the book how I define it, but they range from ordinary millionaires to some of the wealthiest billionaires in the world, and counted among them are some of the most well-known figures in business, politics, and that sort of thing. So really, one of the most important things in this project is anonymity. So any names that I use in the book or here today are changed, and any identification is changed as well to ensure anonymity and fulfill their trust. So I in addition to the interviews, the interviews that were about 1 to 2 hours, I also did what's called participant observation, where you fully immerse yourself in a world, whatever it is you're studying. So I spent a lot of time at exclusive clubs, in people's homes, political organizations, houses of worship, recreation areas, bars, restaurants, everything really in between. And that really gave me a really sense of the kind of tapping into what it's like on a day-to-day, kind of what their day-to-day lives are like. Fourth is what I call social networks. And that's not necessarily Facebook or Twitter social networks, but people's actual social networks, friendships, political connections, these sorts of things that really matter. And I'll show some of the results from my data from the social network analysis. But these involve, a lot of them were sitting on a board together, or their friendships, which I was able to gather through the interviews. And then lastly, it's based on a great deal of quantitative information. So really trying to provide data-driven insights, similar to some of the data that Jonathan just showed about philanthropic giving, environmental conservation, real estate development, everything from, like, I gathered how all of the descriptions on Zillow about how if you're selling your house, how folks try to market their home to the ultra wealthy. So looking at very expensive homes, and then what sorts of themes are used in the marketing materials. So that's the sort of general idea in terms of the data. Well, what did I want to know? Unlike some of my other projects, this research was really wide-ranging, but it broke down into 4 different areas. So what I call the cultural logic of wealth. Questions such as, why did they think their life turned out the way it did? Does having great wealth actually make life more difficult? It sounds odd, I know, but, or how can we tell the difference between hard work and privilege? How much wealth is too much? Do they feel criticized? They feel sometimes ashamed or guilty? Or do they really have trouble sleeping at night? It's like some people might want to think. And then second was community and character. So, which relates more to what we're talking about here. How do they define community? What is their obligation to community? What constitutes a good person? It's a very broad kind of philosophical question. What makes a person or a community more authentic versus non-authentic? And what role does money play in all of this? Third was awareness and action. Are they aware of the fast-growing gap between the ultra-rich and the poor? Some of the data that Jonathan just showed. And then how do they perceive of environmental problems? So these are more the political questions. How do they think about, and how do they talk about issues of racial, ethnic, or social class discrimination? And moving beyond what they might say in an interview, how do these opinions that they tell me actually influence their behavior. And that's more difficult to get at, but I tried. And then lastly, perspectives of the working poor. So in a community like this, in Teton County, defined by such haves and have-nots, which is increasingly in the United States as a whole, what might those at the very bottom of the economic ladder actually think about those at the very top? So I didn't just study the ultra-wealthy. And the book is about that, but the last section of the book is based on 50 interviews with working poor, many of them immigrants in Teton County, and all about their perceptions of wealth. And a lot of them have direct experience working for folks, so they are a very good group to talk to. So essentially, what does ultra wealth look like through their eyes? So today's talk, though, an important caveat is that I can't get to all of that, but I'm going to focus, per Jonathan's request, on philanthropy and some of the issues that are really relevant to what we're going to talk about today. So the first is 3 sections of this talk, and I'll present data for each, is this idea that Jonathan and I were talking about, and some others are wondering about, is this new guard versus old guard here in Jackson. The new, not so much new money, but people who have come more recently versus those who have been here for a few decades or more. So did I observe differences between those groups? Second, where is the money and social influence flowing? And so I'll present some data on this. I think some of you may have a good idea where money flows and which groups receive more money than others, but I'll present some of that. And then uniquely, I think I'll present social influence, which is just as important in a lot of ways. And there's a feedback loop, obviously, between money and social influence. And so what do these findings really tell us about the character of the community and its character moving forward? And then more intimately, why do ultra wealthy people give away their money? Jonathan said they may give it away at higher rates, but I think we could talk about that. But I'll present some findings about the reasons why they told me and the reasons why what I observed about how they find meaning in giving, essentially, what it actually means to them. So first, this new guard versus old guard question. I'm sure, again, it's no surprise Jackson has changed. We all know that. It's changed dramatically, even in the last 10 years. And this change continues. Development, obviously traffic, it's a favorite topic. And then places like Shooting Star have went up, and more tourists are coming every year. So one question that I had was, how do those who have been here, those who are well-to-do, how do they view those changes? A lot of it, this may sound familiar again, is this idea of Aspenization, that over and again there's concerns about the eroding character of Jackson, so that the people who are coming now are somehow different. So it's not the money that matters really, it's the type of people and essentially how they display their wealth in a certain way that does not conform to the traditional way of how you should act if you have money in Jackson or Teton County, and even Big Sky for that matter. So these folks have different tastes in what they buy, what they wear, how they carry themselves. And so there's a cultural disjunct there and almost a lamenting that the character of the town is changing because of, and they sort of essentially blame that on a lot of the new residents. I wanted to read an excerpt rather than just describing that concept to you from the book, which includes some quotes, so bear with me. Eric Alexander is an Ivy League educated banker who, after making a vast sum of money, came to Wyoming to get away from his rich peers on the East Coast. Even for a multimillionaire, Eric considers himself to be a pretty down-to-earth guy with a good head on his shoulders and feet on the ground. Throughout our interview, he complains about rich assholes who not only give the wealthy a bad name, but actively damage the sense of community in Teton County. Reflectively, he says, "I'd say the thing that bothers me most is what's going on down in Shooting Star," referring to the controversial new country club in town that many ultra-wealthy view as more Aspen than Jackson Hole, more Colorado than Wyoming, more rich asshole than wealthy normal person. He continues, all these properties are being bought up by dot-com people or Wall Street people. Those are the people I came out here to get away from, and they're following me. So I inquired to why Eric wanted to get away from them in the first place and what it is about them that might rub him the wrong way. He says, they'll change the nature of living out here because they're the kind of people who come out here with a different set of values and a different set of tastes where what you're worth defines how important you are. So as we continue the conversation, I wonder to myself if Eric recognizes the thick irony and obvious hypocrisy of all this, that he really is what he hates. Having recently moved to the area from the East Coast just 10 years ago, building his own multi-million-dollar home, I asked him about this. And he acknowledges the irony, but again, his criticism is not wealth, but the shallow values of some of his new wealthy peers, the bad apples, so to speak. He says, I don't mean to sound like a curmudgeon, that, okay, we moved here, and nobody else should move here, and it's all ours. I don't want to sound like that. But when you see these people buying $3 and $4 million townhomes without ever seeing them, you kind of wonder about that. And just, it's a place to be if you're in San Francisco or Silicon Valley or Fairfield County or Westchester County. And I can just see that in every damn cocktail party back east, people are dropping the names of where they just bought a place in Jackson. I don't like those people a whole lot. So that conversation goes on for a little bit longer, but kind of gives you a sense of the cultural, some cultural conflict essentially that's happening around not wealth itself. There's no problem really with the wealth. It's how you use it and how you present it, and then your values. Another topic on this idea of new guard versus old guard is the local knowledge deficits, as I call them. And I put a question mark by less giving because I'm not 100% sure about this, but I'm pretty confident that the amount of time you spend living here corresponds to your knowledge of the area, which could then again correspond to how much you know about issues, and then obviously give money. So providing, developing a personal connection to issues. So again, I want to provide an example of this. There was a CEO from the West Coast, and he's a recent arrival, just in the last couple of years, about 5 years. And during the interview, we had a conversation about how to improve the community. So I had all these sorts of questions on the interview guide about what would you do, what would you change about the community, how has it changed, how can we make it better, what things don't you like, what groups of people don't you like, why don't you like these groups of people, these sorts of questions. And his response about how we can improve Teton County was, he said, I quote, I wish they would put in 2 extra lanes on a couple of the key roads so those who want to go slow can go slow, but I want to go fast. It'd be nice to have a direct road from Teton Village to the airport. Instead, you've got to either drive north or south, and it's like 45 minutes. Well, when it could be 10 if they would build a bridge over the Teton River. Yeah. He lives just, I can't say exactly where, but near the Snake River. So he didn't even know the name of the Snake River unless he's an expert in Idaho and he just mixed them up. But and so he kept going, and he said the other thing is I'd love to see them extend the runway at the airport and make it longer and safer, and bigger planes could get here. We've had too many accidents, and I think that we could improve the runway with that. So this is just one example. In the book I have, with these themes, I have all sorts of quotes and conversations that represent these larger findings. But I continued probing, asking about philanthropy. I said, so a lot of people I've talked to mentioned the philanthropic efforts going on around Jackson Hole. Have you been involved in any of that? That was a standard question I asked most people. And he said, no, I'm not around that much, and once in a while I'll get something in the mail, but I don't get much. And and he paused. He said, well, we do support that music festival that goes on in the summer. We go there every once in a while, and we support that. But I'm more in California, so that's where I do my thing. So in other words, his vision of addressing problems was building more roads, essentially making it more convenient, and then also nominally contributing to the music festival that's held every summer. And so somehow he was pulled into that, even though he's not really that involved, and I'll get to some of that later. So my sense is that newer residents were more likely to lack a baseline knowledge of the history of the area, which is not surprising, and in the problems that it faces. But there's a critical caveat here, though, too. So when they were knowledgeable, they were much more likely to know about environmental issues rather than some of the other pressing socioeconomic problems around immigration, wages, housing, and even prejudice against certain groups. These sorts of problems that are here, they often knew nothing about that. Many were not aware that roughly 30% of the community are immigrants from Mexico, and that they actually live here and are raising families here. And so this lack of knowledge matters for everything, but it really matters for those issues, I think. And what I call in the book buzzkill issues, essentially, for the new residents who move here, that they're imagining a paradise, and I mean, it is nice here, but consciously and subconsciously cannot be really bothered by human suffering. So as they tell it, that's why they came here in the first place, was to get away from those sorts of social ills. So they don't really know about it, but when you raise it with them, it was really difficult to even have a conversation, because, well, one, they had no knowledge of it, but they almost like did not want me to tell them, because then they're sort of like, may feel that they have a responsibility or something. In this next section, I'm going to dig into some of the quantitative data, just briefly, on philanthropy, looking both at financial influence and then social, political influence as well. And it's important to note that the majority of wealthy folks in Jackson are incredibly proud of the philanthropic operation here. They know about it, and they like to talk about it. So, for example, one respondent said, quote, "I would tell you that we have a very philanthropic operation." This is an ultra-wealthy resident who just lives here. And so a lot of people are attracted to come here just because of the philanthropy. Another resident, a longtime finance person from Boston, who was politically left-leaning, rehearses this common theme about the optimism of ultra-wealthy philanthropy that can solve the problems here for overcoming issues pertaining to the wealth disparity that has come about. This person says, quote, "There are over 200 not-for-profits in this community of 20,000 people, which is a pretty amazing number. On a per capita basis, I bet that it's the most philanthropic community in the country." So I think some of the ultra-wealthy are also socialized into thinking that it is the most philanthropic community in the country. And it is indeed obviously philanthropic, but the wealthy are very aware of that, and it's something that they're very proud of. So what I was interested in was, what does this actually look like? Who benefits from the philanthropy? We could talk about the wealthy giving more money away, but where does it go? That's, I think, a bigger question. To how is the community improved through that philanthropy, which is the assumed purpose. So these are empirical questions, only answerable by data. So I'm just going to provide a little bit. I have a lot of different charts in the book, but this is just one of assets from several prominent groups in Teton County. It's tough to see, I'll describe it. These are from IRS 990 forms. So I just pulled out some of the ones that represent some of the major issues going on, and these are the assets of these companies over time. So here you have the Community Center for the Arts, and this is from 1997 to 2014, just in terms of the amount of money that is flowing in. So this isn't individual giving. These are assets that these organizations have in their coffers. So you have the Community Center for the Arts, Jackson Hole Land Trust, the Grand Teton Music Festival, again, staples in the community. Then down here, it's just really interesting to see the growth over time. You have the Community Resource Center, the Latino Resource Center, the Jackson Hole Community Housing. This is before the merger, these data. Just flatline, and these others upwards of 40 million. So you just see the disparity there in terms of where money is going. These are difficult because similar to the way that the IRS data that Jonathan provided, you don't know where they're giving. It could be outside of here. These are assets, so it's hard to track. These aren't my respondents gave money to these particular organizations, but the assets and organizations have tells us a lot. I think reveals priorities in the community as well. So I think more interesting and maybe more unique for you all who probably are familiar with some of the philanthropic giving is social influence. So this can often be more important than financial influence. So I was interested in where the social, political, and cultural power were flowing within the community. And for this I used a technique called social network analysis or network science. You look at the relationships between individuals and organizations, between organizations and organizations, and that way you can map out essentially the political or social ecology of organizations and people. And these data are all from Internal Revenue Service tax forms from 1997 to the present. And it's all the organizations in Teton County, so every organization that filed a return. So this is kind of, this is just to show, yeah, it looks cool, it's like art. It's my art project. So the red circles are organizations, all nonprofit organizations between 1997 and now. And those are the red circles, and then the green circles are individual board members. 4,060 people over that time period. And if those organizations share a board member, there's a connection. So the connections are the white lines between them. And so the size of the circle too represents what's called in network science centrality, which is essentially those in the network who have the most power. So if you think of one of your friends who knows everybody and they kind of connect you to lots of different friends, that person would have a high centrality score. So what we're looking at are, these are some of the most prominent organizations who have people connected all over the community. I put this in a different form, put names on it. So Community Center for the Arts, you can see some of the larger organizations in the community. This is interesting to look at. It just kind of gives you a sense of the scope of all the different organizations. But I'll get into some more analysis where we can draw a few more conclusions. But essentially, it's really important to look at who sits on the boards of organizations, and if they sit on another board, those two organizations can share a person, essentially, and could share resources, share connections, all these informal ways that power is distributed, that finances are distributed. So put this in a different format. So this is a measure of influence over here on the y-axis, and those with the most social influence in the community, again, mirror those who have the most assets, which is not surprising. Jackson Hole Land Trust, by far, has the most connections of their board members to other organizations in the community. Then you have the Grand Teton Music Festival, and look at how these grow over time. So this is not something that was constant. Something happened between 97 and 2012, 2013, to where they grew their social influence and built their connections. So you have the National Museum of Wildlife Art, Community Center for the Arts, Latino Resource Center, and then Jackson Hole Community Housing and the Community Resource Center. So again, it mirrors that last graph, where these organizations have very little social capital in the community relative to some others.
What happened in 2009?
Yeah, good question. What was that? Yeah, that would make more sense for assets, but I'm not sure for social influence. You can see the Latino Resource Center jumped up. Maybe on their board they brought on people who are connected to some of these other organizations who have a lot of connections. So it could have been a handful of people that could really raise the boat of that organization in terms of their social capital.
Justin, it was also a time of massive prioritization as well.
Okay.
So people got off boards and focused on the boards that they were really passionate
Okay,
about.
yeah.
So I think that's part of the data.
Interesting.
Repeat that answer.
Sorry, hi guys, Elaine Carney. I think I observed in my work in the community that during that time many board members and donors were consolidating their giving and their participation, and so they actually moved away from some of the boards and really just served on one or two as opposed to 4 or 5. So that could be part of that data result as well.
yeah, it's consistent across all the groups except for Community Resource Center. Relatedly, not really pictured here, I found that inter-organizational ties are strongest among sectors of it, environmental conservation and arts. So those two sectors shared a lot of people. And but they're not as likely to be connected to social service, human service organizations. Human service organizations largely operated in isolation, which really hindered their ability to tap into people and money in high places, essentially. Okay, let's look at specific people. One is Abigail Smith, a longtime executive director. That's a fake name. It's a real person, fake name. This is her social network. She's the director of a human and social services organization. And then I'm going to look at another one who I named in the book, Clark Moore, who's an heir to a multi-billion-dollar business conglomerate, and just look at his social connections. So let's start with Abigail. This is Abigail, red dot here in the middle. She was a longtime resident of Teton County and worked for nearly 2 decades for a handful of nonprofits focused on housing, mental health, education, and some other issues. And this is her world of social connections here, based on her work as the director. So in her immediate network are 112 people. That's who she's connected to, and then who these friends are also connected to. For example, like this friend is very well connected, larger dot. Does that make sense? Okay. So essentially her, well, why does this matter in the sense of how many connections you have? Well, in 2009, her organization faced several $100,000 in government cuts, while at the same time, the housing crisis and economic disparity led to an increase in people needing her services. So what this figure shows us is that, unfortunately for Abigail and her organization, and for the increasing number of people who need those services, they had much less social capital with which to draw as they attempted to stay afloat as an organization. So in addition to offering less inroads to new assets, new human capital, it also made the organization far less resistant to inevitable threats like funding cuts. So it was a much more insecure situation in terms of reaching out to friends and those sorts of things. Well, now this is in stark contrast to someone like Clark Moore, who because of his economic and social power, the social influence that he has, become quite involved in local philanthropy. Again, he's the red dot there. And then the white is so bright because there are so many social connections between his friends. So if you look at, it's very sparse. Abigail's friend, she might have a friend down here who has a couple of friends in this network. And by friends, it's not just going out for a drink. It's obviously somebody who sits on another board that you can, in a professional way, reach out to network. So back to Clark. So essentially, he has much more social influence. And conservation and arts organizations are better equipped to lure people like Clark to serve on their boards. And when those organizations are in need, people like Clark are socially equipped to help with all the connections. So his world of connections here in Teton County, he has immediate access to 10 times more connections than Abigail. And these relations are often with folks who themselves are well connected and well healed. So his network's not only further reaching in Abigail's by more people, but it's much more concentrated with connections. And of course, this is only for Teton County. This does not involve Clark's social, political, corporate connections available to him outside of Teton County, which I imagine are great, because many of the ultra-wealthy people obviously made their wealth from outside of here and then moved here. So certainly Abigail, she's devoted her life to philanthropy, has put in several decades of work to build relationships with people, the organizations, in addition to raising money and overseeing services for those in need. But despite this work, she does not have the broad and resourceful network from which to draw to solve problems.
Is Clark old guard or new guard?
I would have to look. I was asked if Clark is old guard or new guard. I'm not sure off the top of my head. Yeah. Trying to figure out who, yeah. I changed some things, like, yeah. Yeah, no, I never changed gender, but where they come from, there's a process. All right. Just trying to get me to reveal, yeah. It's Jonathan. That's it. Okay, lastly, just to finish up, and this section is a large part of the book. I'm going to just sort of highlight some of the bullet points. Is why do the ultra-wealthy give? Here we're getting into questions about what they find meaningful, determining like their sort of moral outlook on life, some religious outlook on life in some cases, and just the reasons that they want to participate in philanthropy. So first, dollars and cents. Conservation can become an engine for preserving wealth and for producing new wealth, charitable deductions on like an easement or something, or even more abstractly, and this is sort of cynical, I know, but constraining supply in the area to increase your property value. The more people who move here, the more houses there are, the less your house is probably worth, in most cases. This idea of presumed altruism. So there exists among them this pervasive and like persistent but vague feeling that they ought to look out for nature, and doing so is an altruistic contribution to the greater good. And on average, there was just this latent sense that, yeah, we need to protect nature. It's very vague, and it often revolved around charismatic wildlife, moose, these sorts of things. And the quotes around that are really interesting, and I'll kind of get into some other issues here. Keep going. Therapeutic benefits. So donating to protect a specific experience of nature that's focused on its therapeutic benefits for them. So nature is valued for its health-giving rewards, mostly through its aesthetic beauty. And of course, many non-wealthy people like myself, relate to nature in this same way. But I think it was unique is that from the perspective of the ultra-wealthy, many of them have, since college, really thrown themselves into intensely stressful careers that, according to them, can result in overexertion, greedy materialism, this is their word, preoccupation with power, moral, spiritual hazard. So in other words, what they view as the opposite of going out in the Tetons or something, or in the parks. So they've made sacrifices to get to a point where they now realize that they need, and especially deserve, the tonic that a certain experience with nature can provide. And so giving toward that, toward protecting those benefits. 4 is recapturing what I call authenticity. I had this in quotes earlier, but because it's a vague term, but for example, one person said to me, he said, "Oh my God, what have I sacrificed in my life to get to where I am?" And so this quote, and so many others like it, revealed a lost sense of authenticity that I unpack in the book. And they're I know this sounds sort of vague and philosophical, but aiming to get back some sort of part of themselves that is more genuine, that's more sincere, it's more simple, uncontaminated by their career, by the stressful lives that some of them lead. And giving can help them accomplish this in different ways. 5 is what I call this new Rockefeller idea, is that for some ultra-wealthy, they come here and they learn about Rockefeller and what he did, and it becomes a local prototype, and almost like a hero for the ultra-wealthy. And I have story after story about this brand of do-it-yourself philanthropy, which is attractive because you can make a big splash, in a short amount of time. And its free enterprise approach often was really attractive to them, that it's much more politically comfortable as opposed to a perceived anti-capitalistic or litigious land grabs by environmentalists or by the government. For example, one respondent rents a helicopter every year and goes up into Montana looking for just huge parcels of land to buy and to conserve. Doesn't know much about environmental conservation, but this is the sort of, he always talked about Rockefeller, and that's sort of the legacy he wanted to leave. And so I coined it New Rockefeller. So sixth is, it's just like a leisure activity and a form of social integration. I mean, even this event is in some ways like that. It's a form of, for them, elite socializing. When you move to town, you get involved in some of these organizations to meet other people who have similar means. And it's a great way for them to get integrated into the community. Organizations also target these individuals as well, inviting them to dinners, picnics, events, and the like. So in this sense, philanthropy becomes a leisure activity. And it's just an important form of socialization. So I will say that a lot of those, the ones that are best at sort of forming these social circles are around environment and arts rather than some of the social service organizations are not. I didn't see that as much. Second to last, safe and apolitical conservation. And this relates to the theme above, but taken together, these themes create the impression that conservation is a safe and non-controversial activity. That conservation becomes a watered-down way to be like pro-environment while supplanting either critical or other disruptive ideas, political ideas that might lure one into partisan waters. So it's viewed as kind of like a non-partisan, safe way to get involved. And then 8 is it's a form of status seeking and social prestige. So again, these themes above kind of coalesce into this one as well, that there's a market for social and cultural rewards in this community. And because conservation is seen as, by many, as unequivocally altruistic, and that it's an honorable thing to do, there's social rewards to be gained for being involved in conservation, such as status, distinction, power, exclusivity, respect, public recognition, and other forms of cultural, social, and symbolic capital that impact a person's position within the community. So in Teton County, I think the exchange market for social status is most lucrative around land conservation, obviously. And this means that those with money or power to own or purchase land are in the best position to earn these rewards and the highest rate of return for their altruistic behavior. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
So the idea is that we have about 15 minutes before for Q&A, and we'll pass around a couple of mics for those of you who have questions, and then we'll go into our panel, and the panel is local philanthropists, and we'll get some of their reactions and try to put some stories and human faces on the stuff that Justin talked about. Then we'll break at noon for lunch. There'll be a buffet lunch both out here in the foyer and in the room over there. And the thought was to give you a chance over lunch to just talk about and try and ground what you learned. And then we'll bring everybody back up toward the end after you've gotten a chance to, what did you hear? What did you hear? To ask some more questions. And so we'll go out with a fun-up Q&A. So we'll pass around a couple of mics while I grab those. So the first question is perceptions about old versus new guard. If you could go into a little bit more detail about that. And then the second question, because I'll take that benefit too, is do you find these same social prestige kind of benefits around human services? Because you talked about conservation mostly when you were listing those 8. So old versus new, and then conservation versus everything else.
Yep. I'll do the second one first. No, I didn't find that sort of social prestige around social human services issues. It was not, again, I think it goes back to this idea of, and this isn't for every ultra wealthy person, by the way. I'm making, these findings are at the aggregate level, so not everyone fits into this, but on the whole, a lot of folks move here looking for a paradise, looking to get out of whether it's the I-95 corridor or get out of Silicon Valley and the rush of that, and they hear about problems in Teton County that they dealt with, or read about in the newspaper or on the news back home. sort of almost either block it out or don't become really interested in it, and it's not a thing that they get involved in as much. I'm sure some do, some give lots of money to that, but on the whole, it's a buzzkill to what they envision as this paradise. And the purity of this paradise is the environment and some of the social service human problems that people encounter here damage that. The idea about old guard, new guard, I think that's definitely the case. And I'm thinking about in terms of environmental giving, if folks don't have a basic understanding of what the Teton River is in Idaho, not the one basically almost in your backyard, that's a problem. Maybe they still give money, but it's a problem for a lot of reasons, but for philanthropy especially, I think. Now, I've wondered whether or not this is an age difference, because a lot of the old guard have obviously been here longer, are probably a bit older, and I'm not entirely sure about that, whether or not that we could draw that line with regard to age. But certainly, I've interviewed several folks who just got a place in the village, and they come for only a couple weeks a year, and they know next to nothing about the town. They barely even leave the village, and so I think it's a huge issue. But untangling it, it depends on kind of what you want to know, I suppose, about their giving. But, yeah.
Unfortunately, one of the mics is dead, so we'll just pass them
I
along.
can speak loudly.
Leslie, claim it. Would you please identify yourself before?
Leslie Peterson, a longtime resident here, not one of the ultra wealthy, but someone who's helped raise money for many different outfits. I do think that the new guard are hopeless when they come, and they're incredibly irritating, as you put it so well. But,
I didn't put it.
I mean, but I do think as they spend more time here and they become better connected, they grow in their knowledge. And we have seen two huge developments here that overpowered everything that had happened in the past, which were Shooting Star and Three Creeks. And it's going to take at least a decade to get those people to understand the community better. So perhaps there's hope, and we shouldn't despair yet. Charlie?
The microphone's over here.
Hey, it's on. Jonathan, thank you for your today, and thank you for the presentation, Justin, too. I certainly appreciate it. I'm struck by, first, I don't think there's a way to avoid this, but we're basically talking about a very small sample of people. And earlier, when Jonathan was presenting, we're using 7,000 tax returns, and of that, 7%, if I'm understanding that properly. So really, we're talking about, really a couple, 500 people or so, who really have an almost outsized influence in the community. But one of the things when you were talking about the organizations, or your chart of the organizations that are making the most money, and saying, well, the arts are getting all the money, or the land conservation is getting all the money, really you're talking about just a very few organizations. So it's not as if communally the arts is a well-funded thing. It seems like that's the safe giving that happens, that having a knowledge of community is important for knowing how to give to smaller organizations, or arts organizations, say, that cross over into social service. So I'm just curious about how to become more visible for on-the-ground organizations who are doing work. After all, there's over 200 of us. And it seems like people only know about a very few. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Let's keep one mic with Justin, and I'll move this one.
So how smaller organizations can be more effective?
Not more effective, visible.
Visible.
More effective.
Oh, that might be out of my pay grade, how they can be more visible. With the ultra wealthy, or just in?
Well, when you're talking about social status, to what people give to, it's like, the opera, the art museum, that kind of thing. But in terms of what motivates people to give and wanting to be on the ground effective, you're going to have to broaden your reach to that.
Yeah.
Understand.
Yeah, one, going back, here, one way, in terms of the social service or arts even, when you're not talking about, like the therapeutic benefits that's related to nature mostly, but some of these other ones like status and social prestige, maybe one way, public recognition, things like that would definitely make an impact. But I think a lot of these here relate to environmental giving just because that's what those folks talked about.
That's a very broad.
Yeah, and I will say the point about this is a small number of people relative to the community, but that's almost actually making the whole point, and I think that's what you meant, was that there's a small amount of people who own so much of the wealth, and that's in the U.S. generally too. So my whole argument in this book, when I open the book, is that we often ignore those people. We look at the problems in society, that, like whether it's poverty, and especially in sociology, a lot of these issues, but we rarely look at those at the very top, and mostly because they're harder to study. But I think we should, even though it's fewer people. I think that's what you were saying too. But.
I'm okay. Justin, I have a question, if I might, which I think is probably going to confirm your excellent conclusions and trends, and that is just a question for the entire room. I'd like to see a show of hands of how many people in this room have ever heard of an organization called First in Family. First in Family is a relatively new group that was created to provide scholarships to students here in Teton County who are the first in their family to attend college. So to me, it's so interesting that your trends are right on the mark, but also there are exceptions, and those can be important.
Yeah, that's a great point. There are exceptions. Did everyone hear that? Like, yeah, first in family district. Yeah, I agree. And I'm not, when I put those assets up there, I'm just showing the disparity of some of the more prominent, even social service organizations that we would think as, the Latino Resource Center, for example, is still flat relative to some of the others. And I know that it's obviously, too, more complicated than just having assets. And that's why I looked at social influence as well. But there are all sorts of other organizations. There's a couple hundred of them, so yeah, clearly they're doing good work. But in terms of when the wealthy arrive here, what they're pulled into, but also what they see as a good altruistic behavior is always around the environment.
And status.
And status, which go hand in hand.
I'll bring the microphone back there. For what it's worth, there were about 12,000 tax forms returns filed in 2015 from Teton County. About 1,500 of those were people making $200,000 or more. So that percentage, like 10, 12%, was about 4 times the national average for how many folks in that category. Way back here.
Yeah, I can project. I have one question. I have two questions. I'm going to borrow a cue from Jonathan. I'm wondering if the way that you've listed the whys around why the ultra wealthy give is in any sort of order or prioritization. Did you see any trends in the community here around these, or did they all show up pretty equally as reasons why?
These are not ranked.
Okay.
I will say the new Rockefellers was probably a smaller sort of subset. The status, social prestige is huge. That's huge anywhere. That's not just Teton County. But I think it operates very strongly here. Other than that, these all also sort of go together. The altruism, the political conservation. So in a lot of ways in the book, I don't list them out like this. Honestly, part of it was I wanted to get this in here other than the social and political influence part. And so I just wanted to list them. And so in the book, something like the dollars and cents one's an entire chapter. A lot of these are actually entire chapters except for the new Rockefellers and the leisure activity, social integration. That one too is just a very common thing anywhere. New York City, I mean, you could go anywhere, and philanthropy is a form of social integration into a community. But no, they're not ranked.
My second question is on the dollars and cents why. It sounded like that was a sort of investment business mindset a bit, which seemed a bit at odds with what Jonathan said earlier, that that can be an unhelpful way to think about or approach nonprofit work in general. So I wondered if you had any comments, additional comments.
For me, yeah, talking with them, if they can receive some economic benefits and contribute what they view as some sort of altruistic good, because that's like a win-win. So the dollars and cents thing is pretty straightforward. The tax deduction. I think the other issue in terms of, this is again the more cynical interpretation, is restricting building here, supporting conservation to restrict building so that your home value keeps going up. So the idea,
For that reason.
yeah, so that's, again, that would be another sort of, I suppose, deeper interpretation of the dollars and cents one. And that's not across the board, but it's a theme that emerged.
We'll do 2 more questions, one here.
It's hard to do these justice, by the way, because I have 50 pages on that issue. I'm trying to, yeah.
Good morning, I'm Karen Terra, and I'm wondering in your research whether you discovered these ultra high net worth individuals are looking for experiences as opposed to things. I think that is an emerging concept.
Yes. And what I didn't list here is a whole other half of the book where I look at how they basically are involved in the community. And one of the main things I found was being a normal person, and the experience of being a normal person is huge. Always talking about wearing jeans and basically kind of how I'm dressed, or this is probably too fancy even, that you sit down in Persephone or Cowboy Coffee or wherever, and you don't know who's a billionaire. It could be a billionaire sitting next to you. That's like the best thing ever for them, because they're out of their world, and they come here and they can be normal. And I think that's part of the allergy they have to this new money, where people are more likely to flaunt it. The other thing relative to that is there's an attempt, I think, to erase social class differences. So by that's normally how you dress, what you drive. We can tell that in lots of different communities, kind of what the social and economic hierarchy is. By erasing that, it does sort of erase some of the problems that you might be able to see in a different community, because you can't just outwardly tell who has money, who doesn't. So I think that also hinders some of the progress on the social, economic issues that we see. But in terms of experiences, I would say experiencing an authentic way of life, that taps into Western, sort of the long-lasting kind of Eastern West, coming to Dude Ranch and all these things. So there's that dynamic too, but there's also the dynamic of Jackson is a very normal place for wealthy people. And then the other thing was making friends with normal folks was an experience that they really liked too. So often talking about, it's funny, it has real consequences though. That, they often talked about, the person at wherever, they make my fish or my ski guide, or that they're really friends with them, and they were able to make friends of a lower social class, which is a really neat experience for them, and it helped them sort of tap into something more authentic. And so that was also an experience that was really prominent throughout the book and throughout the interviews. Now, it was interesting, when we interviewed, I actually worked with an organization to do the interviews with the lower income folks to get their view. Are you really friends? You've worked for this woman in her, caretaking her house. Are you really friends with her, or is it just a paycheck? So exploring those issues too, to kind of get a handle on the reality of what the wealthy folks were telling me about their friends in low places, Garth Brooks, and whether they were really friends or not. And so there's all sorts of interesting dynamics there too. So.
Last question. Go ahead. Yeah, Justin, fascinating presentation on where we've been and where we are. Have you done any work on the real question, which is where we're going? And what does all this mean for the future of philanthropy in Jackson?
Yeah. My hope is that the research will help folks who are able to project further. I had this question too in my last book about environmental issues around Yellowstone and around here, making recommendations, but a lot of what I try to do is provide the analysis and then hopefully, and then do talks like this where you all can take what is in there and then kind of push forward. In the conclusion of the book, I'll definitely kind of unpack where I think things are going and maybe make some recommendations, but I try to sort of just present the research, yeah. So, because it's a team, it's a team project. So.
Justin,
Sorry.
what is the name of your book again, and when will it be published?
It's called Billionaire Wilderness, and it should be out like January next year. Yeah.
And who has the movie rights?
Oh, actually, I do. They put it in the contract. Yeah.
So, George Clooney's going to play you?
Right.
Or,
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
yeah. Would you please give it up for Justin?